All right. Yeah, so last week, Jim took us through the three worlds of the text and really, looked at kind of the world around the text, the context, and we're going to kind of get into a little bit more of that. What's the background? What's the history of these people? So that's our task tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And there we go. So, get my slides up. Alrighty. So, here we go. Well, to kind of start this off, I was reminded of a story by that Karl Barth tells in one of his books about Frederick the Great, who was the king of Prussia in the 1700s, and he was an avowed atheist. And I actually don't know if this story is apocryphal or not, but Frederick reportedly said to his physician, Herr von Zimmermann, can you give me one single proof for the existence of God? To which Herr von Zimmermann replied, why, yes, my emperor, the Jews. And I've mentioned this a number of times in our sermon series on Isaiah. The fact that there is still a lineage back to the people of Israel is astounding on so many levels. It's astounding because who in this world traces their lineage back to anyone or anything so ancient? Like, I don't know, Egyptians maybe, but not really in the same way at all. Nobody really traces their heritage, either ethnically or religiously, back to Babylon or the Roman Empire, maybe a little bit to Persia, but not really. So it's astounding also because Israel was never, not even in the time of David or Solomon, a truly major political power or empire. They were always relatively insignificant politically, just kind of an afterthought. So if any lineage were going to survive, you sure wouldn't expect it to be Israel's. And it's astounding because Jews have been persecuted so much throughout history. And it's astounding because with the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple and the exile of their people, that should have been the end of their identity as a people or nation. That's what happened to nations in the ancient world. You take away your center of power, you take away your land, eventually that culture is going to kind of vanish off the face of the earth. So my task this evening is to provide a crash course in the history of the people of God in this story in between. And it really will be a crash course because there's a lot that happens between the Old and New Testament. There's a whole lot of history in this in-between period, history that had obviously a massive impact on how people in Jesus's time thought and acted. I mean, can you imagine, like, for example, if someone tried to understand America in 2020 by only studying the Revolutionary War and the history leading up to it? I mean, you'd understand some things, but if you leave out almost 250 years of our history, that means you're going to miss a lot. You know, no world wars or civil wars, no moon landing, no Emancipation Proclamation, no September 11th. You're not going to understand a lot of political and religious movements that exist, ways people think or what they do. So to only know the Old Testament, it gives us a lot, but there's a lot that happened in the story in between. And a question hanging over this whole era of history, this intertestamental period, is what does it mean to be the people of God? When do we integrate other cultural norms and ideas, and we'll see some integration happens, and when do we reject them? And this is a question I think that, we ourselves are asking in our own pluralistic postmodern world. I think you guys all know that the prayer for the disciples in John's gospel, Jesus famously says, his disciples aren't in this world, but they're not of or from this world. So what does that mean? What does it mean for the people of God in this intertestamental era to hold fast to Torah, to the law, and to the prophets? And what does it mean for them to learn from other people? So what I'd like to do tonight, and if you have an outline, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. What I'd like to do tonight is to provide a very brief preface to the Intertestamental Period, and then look at the Intertestamental Period as 4 movements. And there's so much to be said about and studied in each and every one of these movements in their own right. But since this is a class on the New Testament, and since we don't have all the time in the world, what I'd like to try to do tonight is draw attention to at least a couple of ways in each particular movement that movement impacted the world of the New Testament, the identity of the people of the New Testament period, and oftentimes well beyond it. So here we go. First is the preface to the Intertestamental Period. The preface to the Intertestamental Period is, of course, the Old Testament. That's what comes before it. And hence my reading assignment last week to just go ahead and read the whole Old Testament in a week. I'm going to go ahead and assume a certain level of familiarity with the Old Testament, largely for the sake of time, but also knowing that many of you have been in, the church pews for a while and have heard the story. I also know a lot of you took John Haberlin's class Through the Bible in 1 hour. So this portion is going to be really fast-paced, reductionistic, whirlwind. So if I confuse you, feel free to, type in your questions after the class. But to keep us moving, I challenge myself to give a survey of the entire Old Testament in 8 sentences. And some are admittedly run-on sentences. But one other thing is you'll see on the outline, you'll see in my slides, I have dates there. But I put those, especially the early ones, with a giant asterisk. Hebrew numbering is notoriously imprecise. It can often be symbolic. And if you try to stitch together the number of years and create an internal chronology of the Old Testament, it will create a lot of problems, you will find. So I've just included broad range estimates to kind of give you a sense of the overall chronology, but especially the early dates, hold those a bit loosely. All right, here we go. So first we have the primeval cosmic history. Who knows what the dates are there? Sentence number 1. In one of the strangest and most mysterious sections of Scripture, there is a universal cosmic account of things wherein God creates all things, including people who rebel against God and fall away from God's purposes. The patriarchs, 2000 to 1500 BC. God does something wholly unexpected in that he begins to interact with the entire world by focusing on one person named Abraham, whose son Jacob Israel will be the namesake of the nation, and it is through this one person and nation that God will bless the world. I shouldn't share this because it's not the kind of thing a pastor should share, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is a digression. This is something one of my professors pointed out. He was retelling the story of Abraham. As a Professor Whitworth, I won't say which one. He said, just imagine this for a moment. God says to Abraham, I'm going to give you lots of land, make you a great nation, bless those who bless you, give you countless descendants, curse those who curse you, and all I want you to do, Abraham, is to just cut off the end of your penis. So there you go. There's this is fine. It's an adult ed class. He says if you can't see the humor, you can't see the humor in Scripture if you expect it to be all Bible-y all the time. So my apologies. I'll repent of that joke. I didn't come up with it. All right, back on track. The Exodus, 1600-ish to 1200-ish BC. Through a series of unfortunate events, Israel finds itself in slavery for centuries in Egypt. But God miraculously delivers them out and gives them the law to teach them how to be who they were created to be, and then he tries to lead them into the promised land. Joshua and Judges, 1300-ish to 1000-ish BC. Joshua finally leads Israel into the promised land where they settle and live under a laissez-faire type system where they are kind of ruled by some people called judges, but they might need a king. United monarchy, 1040 to 930 BC. They get a king named Saul who isn't great, a king named David who's mostly great, and a king named Solomon who is great at first and then isn't great. And under these three kings, the people of Israel are united together. And there you can see two maps. The one on the left is Israel united as one nation, and on the right is the divided monarchy. So, divided monarchy, 930 to 586 BC. The kingdom splits into north and south. The northern kingdom is referred to as Israel, with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom is referred to as Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem. Northern exile, 732 BC. The northern kingdom of Israel is defeated by Assyria and hauled away, never to return. This is, for the most part, the end of their history with the tribe of Judah, now the only remaining lineage to ancient Israel. That's it, the lost tribes of Israel. And then we have, Southern exile, 596/586 to 539 BC. The southern kingdom of Judah is defeated by Babylon and hauled away into exile, but when Babylon is defeated by Persia, the Persian Empire lets the exiles go back to Judah and Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, that's the end of our preface. That was the entire Old Testament. It is reductionistic, but for the most part, that we can kind of say that's where the Old Testament ends with the people of God back in Jerusalem, rebuilding their city under Ezra and Nehemiah. So now we can move into the Inter-Testamental Period, and the first of the four movements I mentioned. So the first one is, and here's from the book of Ezra. Ezra chapter 1. The king issued a proclamation through his kingdom that stated, Persia's king Cyrus says, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem and Judah. If there are any of you who are from his people, may their God be with them. They may go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the one who is in Jerusalem. That's kind of, the very end. So into the Persian period. In some ways I could call this the Babylonian Persian period, simply because we don't know for certain the timeline of when all these influences emerged. Some of it may have happened in the Babylonian exile, some happened under Persian influence. The Babylonian exile, remember, that's the southern exile. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the Babylonian exile, it should have been the end of the people called Israel and Judah. They didn't have a temple, they didn't have a king, they didn't have land. So the exile, I think, is the most profoundly creative moment in the whole of Jewish history, for many reasons. And isn't that often the case? Out of suffering and struggle and darkness comes oftentimes some of the greatest creativity and beauty. It's believed a massive chunk of the Old Testament was written in exile. A lot of the histories are written or finalized in exile as the people of God are trying to make sense of who they are by telling their story, and by telling their story through the lens of how did we end up here? Like, what were the events that led us to this place? So when you read the book of Samuel and the book of Kings, you see these editorial comments about the failure of Israel and its leaders and how this was setting them on a trajectory towards exile. Many of the prophets and the prophetic writings emerge out of exile. We've seen a lot of Isaiah in that context. But another reason the period of the exile was so profoundly creative was because, as best we can tell, they emerge out of the exile with this thing called the synagogue. The synagogue isn't mentioned in the Old Testament, and yet it's a huge part of Jewish life by the time of Jesus. Out of the pandemic comes live stream and Zoom adult ed classes, and out of the exile comes the synagogue. Although the synagogue has lasted, and I hope and pray that live stream and Zoom classes don't last as a normative thing. Now, admittedly, the exact origins of the synagogue are somewhat unclear. It's clear it began to have a larger and larger role as Jews spread throughout the ancient world and tried to make sense of their identity so far removed from the promised land, from their homeland. But think about how profound this is in the context of exile. Since they don't have a temple, they have Torah, they have the law. They don't have priests who make sacrifices in the temple, so what do they have? Now they have scribes who help preserve Torah. Prior to the exile, there's no synagogue. You essentially need a temple. After the exile, all you need is 10 Jewish males. That's it, to form a synagogue. So after the exile, Judaism becomes mobile in a way that it wasn't before. There was the tabernacle, but it's really mobile. It can spread in a way that it hasn't been able to before. And it's precisely that feature that allows Judaism to survive 25 centuries of persecution. The old Israel temple model would not have worked. It would not have survived if it required a temple in the same way. But now that the land it's still important, but it's less essential than it was. It can and it does survive. So the Persian period, at least for the Jewish people, it lasts about 200 years. Many of the Jews have returned home to Jerusalem, but they are still under the authority and influence of Persia. They're not autonomous. And a lot of Jews stay back, by the way, and a lot of Jews spread to other parts of the world, the Diaspora. And I'm not going to talk much about the Diaspora tonight, but we'll get to them in future weeks. But this 200-year period is from when Cyrus the Great, we saw that text a few weeks ago in Isaiah, defeats Babylon in 539, and he lets the Jewish people return home, to when Alexander the Great tears through the world in 336 BC. And we'll get to him in a minute. But there's one more thing I'd really like to mention about this period as it relates to the world of the New Testament. There's a prominent Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's actually kind of still in existence today. I think about 200,000 people worldwide adhere to it. So it's very small, but it's a big deal in ancient Persia. Now, apparently their priests or some kind of equivalent were these guys called magus or magi. Ever heard of them? In Matthew chapter 2, the magi come from the east, the region of Persian influence, to find Jesus. But here's where that Persian influence becomes a really big thing as it relates to the world of the New Testament. It has to do with what we might call the spiritual world. Here's what I mean. One of the things that I absolutely love about the Old Testament is how earthy it is. I always say if you want to understand the Old Testament writers, go read like Wendell Berry or John Steinbeck, Grapes of Wrath or East of Eden. Why? It's because they're agrarian writers. They're farmers. Everything is connected to this relationship with the land. I love how concrete the Old Testament is. It's written in Hebrew, and one of the great things about Hebrew is just about every word has a concrete connection. Like the word for faith, that's kind of an abstract term in English, but in Hebrew, it literally is connected to the word for a pillar or a foundation. It's a concrete word. Or many of us have heard, the word for sin. It's an archery term in ancient Hebrew. It means miss the mark. Sin's kind of abstract in English, but miss the mark. We get that. Now, when we get to the New Testament, that's all still very much there. But suddenly, there's a lot more about things like angels and demons and the devil and heaven and hell. Now, those aren't absent in the Old Testament. But they're kind of peripheral. There's really not much about the afterlife in the Old Testament. We've seen some in the Isaiah sermon series about the mountain of the Lord, where all people come together and gather after death has been defeated. There's this place called Sheol that the psalmists refer to, which is some shadow of life, maybe. It's not totally clear what that is. There's appearances of angels, but they certainly don't have names. Even Satan is almost more of a title in the Old Testament, the Satan, the adversary. This appears to be one of the influences of the Persian period on the people of God. As Jim will show in a few weeks, the intertestamental books start having these wild descriptions of things like angels and demons doing battle. Suddenly there are debates raging in the Jewish community about the afterlife and resurrection. Jesus weighs in on those debates. Now let me clarify what I'm saying here. One of the things that I think Scripture teaches us is that God's self-revelation of God's self is a process. It doesn't happen all at once. Abraham and the rest of the patriarchs, they knew God by some sort of generic title, El or El Shaddai. But then later on in redemptive history, God reveals to Moses his name in Exodus. I am Yahweh. That's a watershed moment in the Old Testament. Or there's no law until midway through the book of Exodus. Jacob, Joseph, they don't have Torah. They don't know what Torah is. God meets us where we are at and slowly reveals who he is, and thank God for that. Even when God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, that's often understood by scholars as a moment where God is revealing something more about himself to Abraham. God is saying, I know this is how people worship deities in your world, Abraham. Child sacrifice was quite common in the ancient world, but God is saying, that's not how things work with me. I'm the God of life. Nobody had a concept of Trinity in the Old Testament, and it was really just in its infancy in the New Testament. And yet as we go back to the New Testament, we see that it's there. Moses, as far as we know, Abraham, as far as we know, had no concept of the Trinity. So God's self-revelation is gradual until God fully reveals himself when he comes in fullness as Jesus Christ. So here's how I look at this. As Jews interacted with their Persian neighbors, it pushed them to consider aspects of God's creation they hadn't thought about much or written about much or prayed about much. That maybe they should go back and take a closer look at some of those texts that mentioned messengers of God or angelos, angels. And this goes back to that initial question I asked. What does it mean to maintain one's identity as the people of God? Some people say, oh, the Jews, they just ripped off a bunch of concepts from the Persians. And I say, no, they didn't. The Persians believed in dual deities, a good deity and a bad one of equal power. Jews were resolute that Yahweh alone is God. But maybe these conversations, having these Persians, this interaction, maybe it did push them to think and pray and ask more together as a community. What's personal evil like out there? Like demons and an adversary in rebellion against God, a Satan, the devil. The Persians pushed the people of God to think more deeply about the unseen world. Questions of the afterlife, again, were a huge topic in the time of Jesus. He gets asked about resurrection on a number of occasions, and he himself teaches about hell, which is not really found in the Old Testament. So I think this is so cool how God works. Jesus can come in as God incarnate and clarify some of these questions that perhaps wouldn't have even been questions the people of God were asking if not for their interactions with the Persians. Jesus uses a Persian word as one of his last words. He says to the thief on the cross next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That is a Persian word. Paradise is a Persian word. And if not for this moment in Jewish history, Jesus perhaps wouldn't have been able to communicate that truth to the dying thief and to us, because nobody would have known what it meant. Nobody would have maybe been asking that questions. They would have said, hey, when we die, we go to Sheol, and that's it, maybe until the final bodily resurrection. And to be clear here, the Greeks also had some influence. Jesus uses the term Hades, for example. But the Persian influence seems to be earlier, and it's significant on these cosmic questions and concepts. So the Jews didn't say, hey, we're all Zoroastrians now. No, they remained fixed on who they had always been, the worshipers of Yahweh and Yahweh alone, keepers of Torah. But God used a pagan nation and a pagan belief system to push them to ask deeper and different questions about the world he created, the world beyond what we immediately see, the world of angels and demons and afterlife and heaven and hell. Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, these personal names of angels are only discovered by the people of God in the Inter-Testamental Period. Gabriel's mentioned actually in the book of Daniel, but Daniel's probably the latest book written in the Old Testament. Okay, so that's the Persian period. Second movement. And again, there's so many things that can be said about each of these movements. I'm just trying to narrow in on one or two things. The Persian period goes about 200 years, from 539 to 332 BC. Well, what happens in 332? One of the greatest conquerors the world has ever known storms through, conquers Persia, and goes as far east as India. It's absolutely wild how much territory that is. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian commanding Greek forces, sweeps through the world, just takes out, dismantles these empires that have been long-standing. It's really difficult to quantify the impact that this has on the world of the New Testament, because it's difficult to quantify the impact this has on the entire world. And that may sound like a really huge claim, but it's true. Alexander the Great, he wasn't just a brilliant military general. He was well-cultured and a savvy statesman. His private tutor was some guy named Aristotle. This conquest by Alexander the Great is referred to as the Hellenization of the ancient world, and that's just a fancy word for Greek, the Greekization of the ancient world. So much of the way we think can trace its roots back to the ancient Greeks. So much of our language can trace its roots back to the ancient Greeks. I don't have time to go into this now, but we could spend a lot of time looking at how our understanding of reality itself and how we experience reality can trace its roots directly back to those titans of Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. And Alexander the Great was partly or even largely responsible for bringing those ideas far and wide. So here's what made him so brilliant. He didn't want to just come in and impose his will and force people to adopt his customs. He would absolutely wipe out an opposing army, but he would treat the citizens he conquered pretty humanely, as if he were not their conqueror, but had been their loyal ruler all along and had just freed them from oppressive control. So whereas most despotic rulers up to that point in history would come in and impose their will, but in doing so, the people would always internally and sometimes outwardly rebel against it and eventually throw it off, he wanted them to love the Greek culture that he loved so much. And because his approach differed so greatly, his impact was far more lasting. For perhaps the first time in world history, there was a standardized language across the world, at least, the world known to European historians. Greek and Greek customs absolutely took over the ancient world. Greek is a remarkable language. Hebrew is maybe better for poetry, but Greek is better for science, for math, for philosophy. It's a very precise language. So the New Testament writers would not have spoken Greek as a first language, but they sure knew it. They had to know it. It was like English today. It was the language of economics, of everything. And the New Testament is written in Greek, and that is almost solely because of Alexander the Great bringing it all over the world. And because it was written in Greek, because most of the world spoke Greek, its message was much easier to spread than it would have been without Alexander's influence. Now, there's a lot of dispute among New Testament scholars over just how much Greek philosophy influenced its writings. So like the Apostle Paul, for example, he seems to know Greek philosophy and rhetoric, but he uses a more basic form of Greek called koine. All the New Testament writers use that more basic Greek, which suggests he maybe didn't have any true formal training. But here's the takeaway. Greek thinking and rhetoric clearly made its way throughout the ancient world. Even if not by formal education, it was all around you. It was in the air you breathed. in the same way, a lot of people haven't had a formal American education, but for different reasons, American culture has seeped into local cultures pretty much everywhere in the world by now to some degree. And so here's the thing. There's simply nothing like Paul's letters, for example, in the Old Testament. The prophets are masters of poetry, but they couldn't have written a letter like Paul, even if they wanted to, because Hebrew isn't the precise language that Greek is. They didn't know Greek. Something like Paul's letter to the Romans, with all of its very finely developed points and pinpointed arguments, that's possible because of the Greek language and the Greek rhetoric. The Greek language was so compelling that people stopped using Hebrew, and it began to die out as a language. So as Jim mentioned last week, Jewish rabbis worried that the holy texts of their people would be lost to history. They decided they'd better translate the Old Testament into Greek, and that's called the Septuagint. And when the Old Testament is quoted in the New Testament, as Jim said last week, they're quoting from the Septuagint almost, I think, every time. Things probably would have been okay under Alexander the Great. As I said, he was pretty humane in how he treated the citizens he conquered. But Alexander the Great, as best as historians can tell, burned himself out. His conquests were so successful in part because he moved so swiftly and aggressively. Sometimes his army would show up at a battlefield after marching all day for hours and hours and hours, and instead of resting overnight, they'd just attack right then. He overworked himself, and he died at a young age. Now, where Alexander the Great wanted to spread Greek influence, his successors were just bloodthirsty generals, frankly, without any culture. And they split up his empire among the four of them after Alexander died: Cassander, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus. And you don't need to worry about remembering those names, except maybe Seleucus. Because Seleucus is more or less the general who gets control over Palestine or Israel, the Promised Land. And here's this quote from First Maccabees. Alexander the Great had reigned 12 years when he died, and his ministers ruled each in his particular domain, and these wrought much evil on the earth. So things don't go well from here. The Seleucid Empire, which you may or may not have heard of, there is some fighting back and forth with Ptolemy's empire, which is in Egypt, but the Seleucid Empire really ends up controlling this region of Israel or Palestine for longer. And that's, by the way, I gave you that glossary of terms. That's to kind of clarify why I'm using some terms as synonyms. So on the timeline you'll see we're still under the Greek period. It's technically a different empire, kind of, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just kind of keep all of this under one period. And the Seleucid Empire is not a good thing for Jews at all. There's a lot that could be said here, but in particular, we're going to talk about the nasty, nasty Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who is featured on that coin there. Antiochus IV was the ruler of the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC to 164 BC. And his empire was primarily north of Judea, and he wanted to use Judea as a buffer against the Ptolemy's empire, which was primarily south of Judah. So Judah's this land bridge in between them. So he thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll make them fully adopt my culture. Unlike Alexander the Great, however, he doesn't do this by trying to make his subjects love him and love his culture. He does it by brute force. And Antiochus Epiphanes is particularly brutal. First of all, he gives away the high priesthood to the highest bidder in Jerusalem. This is sort of like what happened with popes in the Middle Ages. There were a lot of popes who had no business being popes. They were just power-hungry politicians or wealthy aristocrats. So as you can imagine, this infuriates the people in Jerusalem. They hold the temple as so sacred. They rebuilt it under Ezra, and now he's just sold away the priesthood to someone who should not be a priest. So they kick this guy out, who Antiochus Epiphanes had sold the priesthood. They boot him out of Jerusalem. Well, what does Antiochus Epiphanes do in response? Well, here's a description. He thought that Judea was in revolt. Raging like a wild animal, he set out from Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. I don't know exactly on those figures if those are precisely accurate, but it's a whole lot of people. He is brutal. So he forbids adherence to Torah. He seeks out copies of it and he has them destroyed. If you keep Sabbath, you get the death penalty. You try to circumcise your infants, you get the death penalty. And in 167 BC, he desecrates the temple in Jerusalem. Now, how does he do that? He goes into the temple and he sacrifices a pig on the altar. Now, I trust that many of you know that Jews do not eat pork. It's not kosher at all. This goes all the way back to the Levitical food laws in Leviticus 11. It's considered unclean. Jews do not eat it. And this is as offensive and devastating as it can get for the Jews, to walk right into the temple, the holiest place where heaven meets earth, go up to the altar of the Lord and sacrifice a pig. And this action becomes known as the abomination that causes desolation, which is mentioned in the book of Daniel and actually in the Gospels. Jesus says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing in the holy place, as was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Now, when Jesus uses it, he seems to be using it as kind of an analogous event. He's referring to this action by Antiochus Epiphanes, which is, long past history by the time of Jesus. And he's drawing an analogy to what the Romans will do to the temple in 70 AD, which is well after Jesus has died. And you'll hear more about that in future weeks. So the temple thoroughly desecrated. Antiochus Epiphanes IV says, okay, it should be no problem now to convert everyone to the Greek religion. Let's make this temple a temple to Zeus. And so for 3 years, the temple in Jerusalem is a temple to the Greek god Zeus. There are pagan sacrifices. There is temple prostitution happening there. Well, that strategy would work in a lot of places, places that already worship lots of gods, but that won't work with the Jews, who have a fierce covenantal loyalty to Yahweh and Yahweh alone. They can't just add Zeus to their pantheon. And not only that, but these Jews have the audacity to believe that Yahweh will actually protect them and vindicate them. So now we move on to the next movement. The Maccabean period. In the outskirts of Jerusalem lives a man named Mattathias, who in this dark time calls on Jews who are faithful to the law to follow him and his 5 sons into the Judean mountains. John, Simon, Eleazar, Jonathan, and most famously, Judas Maccabeus. And the Maccabean Revolt begins. This is considered one of the greatest and most improbable military victories of all time. This vastly outnumbered little band of Jewish guerrilla fighters is striking from the Judean hills. They're somehow able to throw off the superior, vastly superior forces of the Seleucid Empire. Now, part of that is because the Seleucids had other problems on other fronts and they don't have a lot of time or resources to devote to Jerusalem, but it is nevertheless a hugely impressive victory. So they repeal all of these horrible practices in the temple, and Judas Maccabeus marches in on December 25th, 164 BC, and cleanses the temple. And this is the birth of the feast of Hanukkah. Jesus actually celebrated this festival. In John 10, it mentions him going to the festival of the dedication of Jerusalem. That's this. When the Maccabees, the festival dedication is celebrating when the Maccabees liberated it from Antiochus Epiphanes and from the Seleucids. My folks had the Peter, Paul, and Mary Christmas album. Any Peter, Paul, and Mary fans? And so we'd often have that playing at Christmas time, and Peter is Jewish. So they have this song on the album that you may have heard about Hanukkah. It says, "Light one candle for the Maccabee children, with thanks that their light didn't die. Light one candle for the pain they endured when their right to exist was denied. Light one candle for the terrible sacrifice justice and freedom demand. But light one candle for the wisdom to know when the peacemaker's time is at hand." That's the Maccabean Revolt. That's Hanukkah. No more terrible Antiochus Epiphanes. And the forces of the Seleucid, they kind of fought back and forth for a few more years in skirmishes, but that eventually tapered off. So the Maccabees, they start ruling in Jerusalem in 164 BC. It's sometimes called the Hasmonean dynasty. That was just another family name of Mattathias, an older family name. So people are thrilled, as you can imagine. They had thought the exile was over when King Cyrus of Persia let them return home. But even then, as I said, they weren't really autonomous. They were under the control of Persia. And then things had continued to go poorly, really poorly, under the Seleucid Empire. So they had wondered if they were maybe actually still in some form of exile, even though they were in Jerusalem. But now, with the Maccabean Revolt, now it seemed the exile was truly over. Yahweh, it seemed, had vindicated his name and his people. For the first time since Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, the people of God were sovereign over their own land. But, there's always a but maybe not. Power corrupts, goes that old saying, and unfortunately this ended up being the case. The Maccabean or the Hasmonean royal family got bogged down in all kinds of infighting and power plays. In fact, some of the Hasmonean kings don't seem much better than the Seleucid Empire. They are obsessed with Greek culture rather than Torah and Jewish customs. And so with all this power, there's a lot of corruption from the throne and also from the priesthood in the temple. Again, just like those medieval popes who are not in it out of devotion to Jesus or his church, but to powers. That's the same thing was happening in the Hasmonean dynasty with the temple. So it's interesting that during this time, as best we can tell, emerges this little group of people who say, we are fed up with the corruption we see going on. That's not what God intended. We don't have the power to fix the corruption of the Hasmoneans or the temple priesthood, but what we have the power to do is commit ourselves to the Word of God, to the study of Torah, and we are going to commit to living how God intended us to live. And it's this wonderful little grassroots movement of religious people who have decided to separate themselves from the temple politics to a large degree, separatists or paraset or Pharisees. And we'll hear more about them in a future week. But their early emergence is kind of as heroes among all this, as a movement that represented how people were feeling, disillusioned with the corrupt, self-serving Hasmoneans. Well, how bad did it get? It got pretty bad. The Hasmoneans really started fighting amongst themselves, and it reached its worst and final moment when two brothers, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, are fighting over who really belongs on the throne after their father died. And they sort of start a civil war against one another. Well, I have a brilliant idea, says Aristobulus II, and I have a brilliant idea, says Hyrcanus II. Their brilliant idea is the exact same idea, and it's not brilliant, it's idiotic. They both say to themselves, I've heard about this guy from the west named Pompey. I hear he's fighting not too far from here. I'll send an ambassador up here and see if I can enlist his help for my side. And Pompey says to both of them with a smile, "Gladly, I'll gladly come help." And Pompey comes in and more or less eventually claims Jerusalem and all of Judea for the mighty Roman Empire. Now, Rome would have gotten to Jerusalem at some point, I'm sure, but what a terrible, terrible tragedy this is, that they were invited down by these idiot brothers. And so in 67 BC, 100 years after it started, for all intents and purposes, ends Jewish rule over the Promised Land. And this is the fourth movement. I'm not going to spend too long on the Roman period because I understand I've been talking for a while anyway. But also because the Roman period doesn't just fall in the Inter-Testamental Period, it falls within the period of the New Testament. And so we're going to hear a lot more about the Romans in coming weeks. But let me draw some things together on this because it sets up next week's class. There's this ambitious Jew in this time period named Herod. Now, Herod has a two-part plan. One, he marries one of the Hasmonean daughters. Suddenly, he's now part of the royal family. He's married in, right? He's part of the dynasty. Well, he then goes ahead and kills her and most of her relatives, so he's the only one left of the dynasty now. And then, playing the cards, he travels to Rome and manages to persuade the Roman Senate to name him King of the Jews. And so Herod rules as a sort of puppet ruler, a friend and ally to Rome. Herod the Great rules from 40 to 4 BC, and this is the world Jesus is born into. It's a world that is messy. It is a people who are exhausted from corruption and political intrigue. It is a people who have been crushed by foreign rule. It's a people who remember life before Rome. I think of Simeon and Anna in the temple in Luke chapter 2. They probably are old enough that they remember life when Jews still ruled Jerusalem. So the point is, the people of God are once again under foreign power. They feel the weight of heavy taxation, the way that Romans say they have to do life. The exile perhaps then isn't over, even though, again, they are living in Judea and Jerusalem. So I'd actually like to draw tonight's class to a close by going to the book of Daniel and the book of Galatians. The book of Daniel is generally considered, as I said, the latest book in the Old Testament. It's an apocalypsis. You'll remember that word Jim used last week, or parts of it is an apocalypsis. It's a revelation book that uses all sorts of strange images and symbols and visions to describe what is happening in the world and how God will bring about final victory. And a lot of the images that Daniel uses seem to be in reference to people we've talked about tonight. King Cyrus and other Persians like Darius, Alexander the Great and the 4 generals who divide up his kingdom, and that nasty ruler of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes IV. It would be fun to look at Daniel together in light of what we have talked about tonight, but we don't have time for that. What I'd like to draw our attention to is something in Daniel chapter 9. I don't know if N.T. Wright was the first one to make this argument. Probably not, but he's the first one I heard it from. So Daniel is praying in chapter 9 about this prophecy from Jeremiah 29. After Babylon had conquered Jerusalem and hauled the people of God off into exile, Jeremiah had sent a letter to the exiles in Babylon. He said, hey, settle in. You're going to be here for a while. You're going to be here 70 years, in fact. Okay, Daniel is saying, it sure seems like, by the time he's reading this prophecy, it sure seems like the 70 years are up. But the question on everyone's mind that kind of lasts through these periods was, is this really up? Is the exile really over? Yes, we returned home to Jerusalem after 70 years, but is the exile over? Persia still rules over us, and then later the Seleucids still rule over us, and then later the Romans still rule over us. Jerusalem doesn't exactly look as marvelous and mighty as some of those prophecies from Isaiah had said it would. Well, a messenger called Gabriel appears to Daniel. And he says he has some good news and bad news. The good news, he says, yep, God is aware of this promise that he made through the prophet Jeremiah. And yes, in a way, the prophecy of Jeremiah was fulfilled by King Cyrus of Persia, letting everyone go home. But in a way, he says there's more. The prophecy is going to be filled out even more. And the bad news is that it's going to be a lot longer than 70 years. It will be 70 weeks of years, says Gabriel in Daniel chapter 9. Now, you do the math here. The prophecy of Daniel through Gabriel is coming sometime between 490 and 440 BC. 70 weeks of years. That is 70 times 7 years. That is 490 years. 490 from that date puts the chronology of Daniel's prophecy right around 0 AD. So there seems to be this expectation in the Jewish world roughly around 0 AD that maybe God is about to do something really big. And here's how N.T. Wright put it. And this, by the way, is not just Christians. There were other Jewish groups that were saying this is an era of something big. N.T. Wright put it this way. He says, we can see many Jews in the period between roughly 200 BC and 200 AD who were studying Daniel and trying to figure out when the 490 years would be up. Like the Essenes in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls are from. They were saying, we are the people who are the pioneers of that final real end of exile. We are the ones with whom God has renewed the covenants. We are the ones who have the Holy Spirit. We are the ones who have the forgiveness of sins, which is part of the meaning of the end of exile, because Israel had gone into exile because of sin. So the end of exile will mean redemption and forgiveness of sins and a new exodus. There was speculation among many Jews at that time that, okay, some of us came back from Babylon, but the real exile has continued. Maybe they read texts like in Ezra and Nehemiah, which speak of still being slaves in our own land, and what slaves need is a new exodus. So somehow it seemed to so many Jews in that era, it was in this era that God was going to do something big. So just imagine for a moment, if that's kind of in the air around you, when a wild man dressed like the prophet Elijah emerges out by the Jordan River. After the slaves were freed from Egypt and eventually were led into the promised land, into Israel, what did they do? They left the wilderness by crossing the Jordan River. And after Cyrus allowed the exiles to return home to Jerusalem, what did they have to cross? The Jordan River. So when a man called John the Baptizer is inviting people to step into the Jordan River and to repent and re-enter the promised land, it seems to be a picture saying exile is over. The new exodus is here. But it's not an exodus from pagan rulers. It's not an exodus from, sorry, one sec. It's not an exodus from Babylon or Persia or Alexander the Great or the Seleucids or the Romans. Those are actually trivial concerns in comparison. It's an exodus from sin and death. And Jesus' final meal, of course, is at Passover, a celebration of the Exodus. So in Galatians, the Apostle Paul says, in the fullness of time, God sent his Son. I once heard the pastor Earl Palmer say how maybe that had something to do with a world where the gospel could take root and spread easily. So let's pull all of these threads together from tonight. We have a Daniel prophecy that suggests maybe the true end of exile would be not 70 years, but 490 years. We have the emergence of the synagogue because of exile. Most of the prophets in the Bible were stationed in Jerusalem or sometimes in Samaria, the capital of the north, because that's how you got a hearing, near the temple. But Jesus goes from town to town, synagogue to synagogue. How does Paul spread the gospel? He goes into Asia Minor and into Greece, and he finds the local synagogue in those places of the Diaspora Jews. Pre-exile, the people of God are pretty much only in the promised land, but How do you go to a place like Athens and start a ministry there? Well, if there's a synagogue, that changes things. You also have all of these questions for the people of God because of their interactions with the Persians, questions of powers and principalities in the spiritual realms, questions of heaven and hell, questions Jesus can answer and is even perhaps looking to answer because he's divine. You have Hellenization, the Greekization of the ancient world. Because of Alexander the Great, there is, for the first time in world history, a standardized language across much of the world. And later, because of the Romans, you have excellent and reliable roads, means for traveling all over in relative safety. And these prophecies from people like Isaiah about pagan nations, Gentiles, worshiping the God of Israel, Yahweh, begin to be drawn together. So we can see that the intertestamental period is such an important moment for the people of God, precisely because we can see how God was doing so much to prepare his people and to prepare the world for that moment. In the fullness of time, when God sent his son, born through a woman, so that he might redeem those under the law, so that all might no longer be slaves, no longer be exiles, but in this new Exodus, all might now be called sons and daughters. So there we go. That's what I have for you tonight. And now we can transition over to grill the pastor. But I'm going to definitely unmute Jim. And I don't know if Bill's on this call or not. Let me stop the share here. So we're all together. Oops, hold on. I'm going to keep you muted. I meant to just unmute him. Okay. And yeah, so hopefully there's questions, or I just perfectly explained everything that there's no questions at all. Yeah, I will say again, Jim has this great list of books, so I'll add those. I already added the one with a link to the World of New Testament book he used. Someone mentioned N.T. Wright's giant tome, The World of the New Testament, and another one that came to mind this week. Jim, you may have other ones, but I found this. I've had this for a while. It can be helpful just having a good Bible dictionary, and you can look up things like Maccabees and Hasmoneans, and there's just good articles contributed that are concise but give you just that snippet of like, okay, this is where these people came from. All right. From Sam, where does the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha fit into this timeline? Yeah, go for it, Jim.
No, I was just going to say, that's going to be my topic for one of these sessions.
Yep. Yeah, we're looking at that in 2 weeks. Next week, Bill is going to look at the Herodian dynasty and the power play between the Sanhedrin and the Sadducees a little bit. And then the week after that, Jim is going to do a deep dive, or as deep of a dive as you can do in an hour, into the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. So the short answer, though, is it fits in a lot of places through this. They're written at different times, and some of them are written actually after some of the New Testament books even. But yeah, that'll be in 2 weeks, the lecture on those intertestamental books. So hopefully this gives enough context of the history so Jim can jump into the literature, and that'll make a little more sense of like, okay, this is what people were wrestling with at the time. And yeah.
You got to realize what a good job Tyler did, in an hour, covering 400 years. That's longer than the history of America since the time the first white person stepped on the shore, beyond today's time. And it is a lot of details, but he did a great job of giving you the overview and dividing it up into the 4 periods, which we all talk about when we lecture on it, and explaining, briefly, what a highlight was from each of those periods and how it influences us when we look at the New Testament. Good job.
And I've unmuted you as well, Bill. I was looking for Kettering. I was looking for Bill, and I see Kathy there. So I'm Patrice Johnson today, and you're Kathy. I like it.
Yeah. You did an excellent job, Tyler. Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, stuffed. It's like turkey Thanksgiving dinner, you know, just stuffed a whole bunch of stuff in a limited amount of space. It was very good, though. Very, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will say, you know, I kind of mentioned at the beginning how each of these periods are really worth studying in their own right, and not even just in connection with the New Testament. They're just interesting periods of history. And I know, you know, in a Navy town, we have some military buffs, and Alexander the Great is, if you've never read anything about him, fascinating. And same thing with the Maccabean Revolt in terms of, if you're into military history, some really interesting moments in different ways between Judas Maccabeus and Alexander the Great. I would, you know, recommend looking into them because they're both fascinating pictures. Yes, I will post those 8 sentences minus my professor's joke. I was telling Jim it's been weird. I felt for him last week, and it's been weird preaching and then doing this lecture. Everyone's muted, so you tell a joke and you just have no idea if it landed. You're laughing to yourself, and you're like, I hope someone. Are the diaspora Jews the reason Christianity spread so fast? Because they already knew the Old Testament. Yeah, they're a big part of it. I mean, again, you see in the book of Acts, every time Paul goes to a new place, the first thing he does is go to the synagogue. You know, it's kind of one of the tragedies of Christian history is that it doesn't have a more of a Jewish influence any more than it should have. But it starts. It's a Jewish movement through and through to start, and the Gentiles are slowly brought in. But yeah, absolutely, that was the strategy: is go find the synagogue in Rome or in Ephesus and plug in. I don't know if you guys have anything to add there.
No, it's just if you're a Jewish person, you're moving to a new part of the Roman Empire, and you want to find community. Where are you going to go? You're going to go to the synagogue and find the other Jewish folks who are there and say, you know, how do I settle in here? Pretty universal way of, getting in touch.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I will say, that glossary I gave you, it's subject to revision. Like I said, it may have been more confusing before this, but there's just a lot of terms that overlap, and part of that is because these defined lines that we have in the modern world are not exactly the same separation of church and state, right? You know, religious background and ethnic background and all that. But I try to give a little bit of clarity to some of these overlapping terms, like, you know, when does Jew become the term that's used versus Israelite, and what's all that about? So that's that glossary is on the course page if you need it. Barb Buckham, yeah. Did the average Jew in Jesus' time have a basic knowledge of the past 400 years in their history?
Very much.
Yeah, I would say so. Again, we'll see that more with the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, but like First and Second Maccabees, you know, that's where we get that history, and certainly you can't underestimate oral history, which is huge in the ancient world. So I don't know if you guys have anything to add.
Well, just as much as we know our foundation stories, we know the Constitution, we know about the Civil War, we know about those, we know about Darth Vader and Luke, I am your father, you know, so they did know those stories too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, and not to steal thunder from Jim in a couple weeks, but like, you know, the book of Jude, he mentions this dispute over Moses's body between an angel and a demon, and you're like, where'd that come from? Well, it comes from intertestamental literature. So they're just they're quoting it, and we might not even realize they're quoting it, you know. In the same way I dropped a reference today in a text with Rob and Dax about a TV show that neither of them had seen. And I didn't get it. But a lot of time we have that shared culture where we can drop things, and you know that I'm quoting Star Wars, or like, you know,
or Shakespeare. It's more likely that people would understand the way we quote Shakespeare in almost every conversation we have.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Georgianne. I see your comment there. Yeah. Good stuff. Any questions about coming weeks or more from this class? You can always email after the fact. Oh, let's see. I think you might be some autocorrect issues there, Margaret. There we go. Oh, wait. No. Is that where? Let's see. Let me find you guys and unmute you. All right. Dave and Margaret, here you want to repeat your question? I think you're unmuted now.
Talk.
What's that?
You want me just to talk?
Yeah, you can just share your question.
Okay. I just was wondering if that was where they're talking about, I think in Hebrews, where they say that the word is delivered by angels to Moses or whatever, and you think I don't know anywhere where it talks about Moses getting stuff from the angels. Is that apocrypha type thing? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah,
and I was mentioning the Jude one, but I think so. I don't know if Jim or Bill, if you know that reference right offhand.
Yeah, it's part of the Inter-Testamental Period and what becomes eventually rabbinic lore, because no one can see the face of God and live. So there has to be an intermediary of some kind, and that's the story.
Okay. And that's not specifically in the Old Testament, but it's that during that apocryphal time that they figure that out or something. And Jesus, or I mean, whoever writes Hebrews or whatever book it's in, they address that or something.
Yeah, oh, that's right. It's not in the Old Testament. It begins to be formed in the Intertestamental Period. It continues to be. A lot of this literature is trying to figure out what Tyler was saying. This difficult period. Yeah, we're back in our homeland. We're still in exile. And we've got all these foreign influences. And what part of their mythology fits into our Old Testament, and how does it fit?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. Well, cool. It's good to see everyone again. And again, obviously, you know how to get a hold of us. You can always email questions like Larry did last week after the fact, and then you'll have them written down. But yeah, next week Bill is up with the Herodians and this dysfunctional family, to put it mildly. So good. Well, good to see everyone, and yeah, we'll see you next week, if not sooner somewhere. Oh wait, are we gonna have another meet and greet? Yeah, I didn't really get feedback one way or the other. Or do we want to do another virtual coffee on Sunday? Thumbs up. Thumbs up. All right, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Absolutely. Let's do another virtual coffee. Yeah, sounds good. Cool.
Thanks, Tyler.
Yes. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Good to see you.